We want to bring in Wornie Reed, director of the Virginia Tech Race and Social Policy Center. He met Martin Luther King Jr. during the Montgomery bus boycott and joined him on the 1963 March to Washington. He also saw him speak more than 30 times. Wornie, thanks for your time today. Appreciate that.
I appreciate being here.
I'd like to get your take on the status of race relations in your country.
I would argue that they are actually worse than when Dr. King was assassinated.
Why is that?
Well, on several measures, we can demonstrate that. For example, in 2008, there was a study done by a commission to follow up on the Fair Housing Act of 1968, 40 years later. And they found that discrimination persisted almost like it did in 1968. But this was 2008. Okay, if we look at other areas, in the center that I direct, we have demonstrated that employment discrimination has not diminished enough to even speak of since 1967. And if we go to something like the criminal justice system and look at some of the data related to the racial discrimination issues there, it's worse than when Martin Luther King was assassinated. For example, African Americans are about 12, 13% of the population. They're about the same percentage of people who use or sell illegal drugs. However, they are 2/3 of all persons going to prison for the illegal drugs. Blacks use drugs at about the same rates as whites, but they go to prison about 5 times the rate of whites.
So you're looking at the numbers and you're saying that the situation hasn't changed, but it obviously can't be as blatant as the discrimination was 50, 40 years ago.
Well, 1968, we had no formal discrimination in this country. We have not had, since 1968, any civil rights bills passed. We had 3 in that decade: the 1964 Civil Rights Act, the 1965 Voting Rights Act, and the 1968 Housing Act. We have not had any since, any formal discrimination.
Why do you think it's stalled the way it is stalled then?
Well, I think one of the reasons is because there was no agitation, there was no national movement, there was no African-American movement toward racial progress that we had had in every decade of Black American life and history in this country. We didn't have any since the middle of the 1970s. Part of that is because Martin Luther King had been assassinated in the previous decade, but not completely. In other words,
why else?
Well, there were a lot of other things that happened that may be kind of extensive to go into, but it has to do with the way that the FBI and J. Edgar Hoover and others kind of cramped down on the Black Power movement, which was trying to push these things along. And then, in addition to that, many people thought because we had these laws passed that things were better, and that there was no need to do the kinds of pushes that Martin Luther King had done or that people were doing after King was assassinated. But of course, there was a need to do that because we have seen that because there was none of this type of activity, things actually progressively got worse, not better.
So I've read some articles where you were quoted as saying Martin Luther King, although he's got a legacy of being a non-violent person, someone who wanted change without violence, he actually was an agitator. So can you describe to me what that means and how you saw him in that frame?
Martin Luther King, as some people have described him as a revolutionary, because he was trying to change the structure of society. At the time of his assassination, he was saying we're going to have a massive civil disobedience effort in Washington, D.C. to force the federal government to do something about the high poverty rate among its citizens. This was a multiracial effort. And so he said, I'm willing to die for this. And so Martin Luther King, through the years, had gone to jail 30 times. So he was an activist, not a person who sat around and dreamed. People kind of latch on to that last part of the speech that he gave in 1963 at the March on Washington, which was an ad-lib part that he had given in other speeches. And so if people would pay attention to the first part of the speech, they would see where he was and what he was arguing then, and that was not much different from what he was doing in 1968, pushing and pushing and pushing. He was not this person seeking so-called peace, because he was kind of pushed. He's kind of remembered as a peacemaker, a person trying to bring peace between the races, and nothing could be further from the truth. He was trying to bring peace, but peace in the world and not having so many wars. But in terms of the kind of peace internally, domestically, he was saying peace is not the absence of tension. Peace is the presence of justice. And until there is justice, there will be no peace. And he intended to push for that, and he did in his life. And of course, he would want us to have continued that after he was assassinated.
Wornie Reed, sir, I do have to leave it there. I appreciate your time. Thank you so much for joining us today on the program.
You're quite welcome.